morning, America.
Good morning. Good morning. Morning, babe.
Morning, baby. Good afternoon.
How are y'all?
In our last video, we went through and discussed how you can really plan your own cross-country trip. In this video, we wanted to respond to some of the people who've been writing back saying, can you share your GPX? Can you share your Garmin info? Unfortunately, we really can't. We kept really bad records. I was on Komoot, sometimes Google Maps, sometimes. Julianna was using her Garmin, but the Garmin kind of kept conking out. It was a new product and they replaced it on the way, but again, just everything is all scattered. So we kept really improper records. But I am really fascinated with, maps and routes, and if it was me on the other side, I'd want to know what route I was taking. So yeah, I'd like to kind of go through with how we planned our trip, with some of the real successes we had and some of the mistakes we made along the way. But first, if you've enjoyed these videos, go down to that little red button down there and hit subscribe, hit like, hit the alert button. We plan to have a bunch more videos coming out. And as long as we do really cool trips, we'd love to share them with you. I'm going to appreciate it very much. Thanks. Okay, on with the show. We knew we wanted to start somewhere on the West Coast. We figured why not as far west as we can? That put us somewhere in Washington State, unless we were in Alaska or Hawaii, which would be tricky. So we've picked a spot just north of La Push, which is where the Great American Rail Trail starts. We didn't start in La Push because they were discouraging visitors due to COVID. So we started on a beach just north of there called Rialto Beach, and it's almost the furthest west you can get on the continental US. Beautiful setting, beautiful start to the trip. And from there we rode. So from there we followed Washington 110 into Forks. The rail trail hadn't really started yet, or any of the Great American Rail Trail hadn't started yet. They're still developing that section. And then we were able to follow County Road 2010, which connects to the Great American Rail Trail, and in this case, the Olympic Discovery Trail. Our goal was to follow the Olympic Discovery Trail as much as we could all across the Olympic Peninsula. Olympic Peninsula, if you're not familiar with it, beautiful part of the country. Gorgeous trees, rainforests, mountains, seacoasts. It's just exquisite, not to be missed. You don't want to start in Seattle if you're doing a west to east. You want to go all the way across to that far west Olympic Peninsula, because, to miss the Olympic Peninsula is to miss what was arguably the prettiest part of our entire ride. And the Olympic Discovery Trail, fabulous. So our plan was always to see how the Great American Rail Trail would sort out. We knew we couldn't follow it the whole way. There are places where obviously it doesn't even exist, still a project in development. But, we definitely wanted to use as much of the rail trail infrastructure as we possibly could. Our goal was to use Komoot and Google Maps to really connect the dots between rail trails. At a certain point, the Olympic Discovery Trail cuts north towards Port Townsend. We headed east and took the Hood Canal floating bridge, crossed from one part of the peninsula to the other over the Hood Canal. And then from there, we crossed the rest of the peninsula to Kingston, I think is the name of it. Took a ferry over to Edmonds on the mainland. And from Edmonds, we followed Google Maps until we could get to the Burke-Gilman Trail, which skirts around Seattle. And then you're taking different trails like the Sammamish River Trail, Sammamish Lake Trail, I believe, which is a long lake to the east of Seattle. You're trying to avoid the big urban sprawl of Seattle. And we followed that all the way down to Issaquah, which is where things started getting interesting. Because here's where we ran into trouble. The Great American Rail Trail, the GART, follows along the Preston-Snoqualmie Trail, which should lead towards North Bend, where you start climbing up into the Cascades. Unfortunately, that trail led us into a dead end with no real way out, and ultimately managed to get a ride through some real traffic-heavy, winding, shoulderless roads until we got to North Bend. At North Bend, we were able to take the Snoqualmie Valley Trail into the Cascades, through the Snoqualmie Tunnel, and across the Cascades over into the eastern half of the state. Gorgeous trail. We absolutely loved this little stretch, and the tunnel itself is something like 2.4 miles, and what's cool is, you're in this really wet part of the state, and all of a sudden you pop out the other side, and it's a completely different climate. So we followed that trail all the way down into Clay Ellum. In Clay Ellum, we had a choice. We could follow the Palouse to Cascades Trail, also part of the GART, from Clay Ellum all the way to Idaho, but you'd have to cross the Columbia River, which at the time, summer of 2021, the Beverly Bridge had not been completed yet, so there was no way over other than taking the interstate, which also didn't have any shoulders, so that seemed like a no-go. And also there was a long, long stretch of very high desert with what looked to be no services, and we'd heard tales that it's really not ready for prime time, really rocky, really tough riding. And we cut north over Old Blewett Pass, north out of Cle Elum towards Leavenworth, then east now on US 2 into Wenatchee, cross the Columbia, follow the Columbia up some of the ways along really nice bike trails, and that's where we made a big climb out of the Columbia River. It was about a day's worth of riding, just getting out of that Columbia River Valley. And from then on, it's a straight shot all the way across US 2. On Davenport, we were able to take a little Sunset Highway kind of byway, which was very quiet, very beautiful, very serene, pretty much all the way into Spokane. All along US 2, relatively busy road, but the shoulders were great. At no point did we feel like it was any kind of an issue at all. It was very safe riding. Google Maps found us a really nice way from Spokane down to Plummer. Why Plummer? Because that's the start of the Trail of the Coeur d'Alenes, and we definitely wanted to follow the Trail of the Coeur d'Alenes, one of the real, gems of the whole rail trail system in the United States, all the way into, pretty much all the way across into Montana. It just kind of winds its way through the Bitterroot Mountains in Idaho, through some really cool mining towns. Wallace is outstanding. Now we're following the Great American Rail Trail again. It takes you all the way into Milan, which is kind of close to the top of the pass, actually. From there you can connect to the NORPAC. It takes a little hunting, but you can follow the NORPAC, which is a relatively simple trail. It is not a steep climb at all. Maybe 2% grade, it seems like. Goes over the pass, Lookout Pass. And then down the other side, there's a tunnel that we were supposed to take called the Borax Tunnel, which had caved in, and that took us on I-90, which we didn't want to do, and it was okay. Nice wide shoulders at any rate. We got on the route of the Olympians, but the trail deteriorated significantly as we went. Loose rocks, not at all fun riding, and as a matter of fact, we had to get off our bikes and walk it a chunk of the way. And this is supposed to be our downhill day, catching up on some climbing. We managed to get off of that and just get onto some side roads, and sometimes we had to get on I-90, and we took that into Missoula. Our goal was to go south out of Missoula. Going south out of Missoula, you're looking at US 93, and there's a bike trail that kind of follows that all the way south to a place called Grantsdale. At Grantsdale, you can take Montana 38 across the mountains, and then it connects to Montana 1 and goes through Anaconda, Butte, and ultimately going to Bozeman, and then you're kind of following that whole Yellowstone to the Black Hills section. And that was our plan. We wanted to ride across southern Montana and get to the Black Hills and then take the Mickelson Trail south. And from the end of the Mickelson Trail, we would find highways to connect us to the Cowboy Trail, and that would take us across Nebraska. Unfortunately, neither of our apps would allow us to make that connection. They kept saying, nope, you have to turn around and go back. It wouldn't allow us to route through it. We saw forest fires there on our smoke map, and we assumed they must be closing the road due to forest fire activity. Well, how are we going to get around this? We could take I-90 and just kind of follow the I-90 corridor, but it was kind of a drag following I-90, I thought. I'm not into that kind of riding. So we were in Missoula, where Adventure Cycling is. So we dropped into their office.
Adventure Cycling.
Adventure Cycling headquarters. Let's see if they've got a free ice cream sandwich for us.
Oh boy, wouldn't that be nice?
And maybe even some advice as to how to go from here.
They suggested we take the Lewis and Clark Trail, and that would take us northwest out of Missoula and really reroute our whole situation. Well, We were just struggling. We were trying to get the hell out of Dodge. I mean, the smoke was getting worse every day. The forest fires were kind of all around us. And we were kind of hoping to be done with some climbing. So we said, yeah, let's go ahead and do that. And we'll take it across North Dakota. Let's be flexible. Let's be spontaneous. And let's completely change our route. And we did. And we completely changed everything out of Missoula. It was nice for a little bit. And then it started getting kind of crappy. The shoulders started running out. And this was a main road through Montana. So a lot of traffic, very, very fast traffic. There's no shoulder for the most part, and drivers were just not being polite at all. Even when there was plenty of room, they wouldn't move over. It was really rattling us. Finally, on US 287 coming into Augusta, our fun just kind of shut down. It's smoky, it's dirty, conditions seem extremely dangerous. What we decided to do was to fly into Kansas City. So we had a bike shop, box up our bikes, and we got plane tickets out of Great Falls, and we flew to Kansas City and got our bikes on the other end, got them all put back together, spent about a week in Kansas City. When we got to Kansas City, everything just kind of chilled out. It was such a relief and such a stress reliever. Why Kansas City? My daughter Kelsey lived there, and it would be really nice to see her. I knew at Kansas City we had bike trails, we had rail trails. Probably 60% of the rest of the ride would be on rail trails, which would be pretty awesome. We spent some really quality time with Kelsey and Matthew, spent some quality time checking out the city and just loved it. And then we took off through Kansas City, and the Rock Island Rail Trail we took south through Pleasant Hill and all the way down to Windsor, and that's where it connects to the Katy Trail. And then you've got the Katy Trail all the way, heads up north towards Columbia, and then south towards Jefferson City, and then just kind of follows through all these different farm towns. Just a pleasure to ride. Very flat, very, very scenic. I mean, when we went through, it was 110-degree heat index, but it was fabulous ride all the way until we got to the little stop of Mockins, I think is how it's pronounced.
Here we are in Mockins, Missouri. This is the end of the Katy Trail, and what we discovered is that we've got a little bell.
You ready?
And then from Mockins, you're on roads. And from there, it's fairly easy. You have easy connections over to Missouri 94. And then you connect to US 67, which is what we took across the Alton Bridge over to Alton, Illinois, and started following levee trails south along the Mississippi. And in Wood River, we connected with some local bicycling folks who the next morning kind of navigated us through a really interesting, I believe it's Madison County. They have such an extensive bike trail system. So they took us all the way through that whole section and then set us loose, and we were heading towards the town of Pocahontas. At Pocahontas, our next drill point on the map is Cincinnati. That's where the Ohio to Erie Trail starts. And so we wanted to get to Cincinnati, a couple of states away. And we knew to do that, we'd have to kind of jot south. We wanted to follow the corridor of US 50. Along the corridor, there's going to be hotels, motels, restaurants, towns, services, water. But we didn't want to take US 50. We wanted to take side roads. And looking at the maps, there's just tons of farm roads that, maybe 1, 2, 3 miles off of US 50. Really quiet, gorgeous riding. Hardly ever did we have to be on any stretch of the road that was anything other than super pleasant. From Pocahontas, we went south following kind of farm roads to the town of Carlisle, which is on US 50. At that point, we had kind of more or less a straight shot following the corridor of US 50 all the way into Cincinnati. So I couldn't really give you a real breakdown of all those farm roads that we took through southern Illinois and southern Indiana, other than to say that Komoot did an excellent job of finding us great routes. Most of them were paved, all quiet, never had an issue. Other than the fact that water was hard to find because there aren't really any shops or any stores or gas stations along these old farm roads. So a couple of occasions we had to stop and say, hey, any way we can, use your hose and fill up our water bottles. So from there we kind of kept going through all the way into the city of Vincennes, which is a very old city. located on the banks of the Wabash River. And suddenly we're in Indiana now. And the roads were very, very different. The way that the land was laid out seemed very different. We went through towns like Lugoti, Bedford. This is the area where we found the steepest climbs of our entire trip. This is kind of hill country, very kind of remote is how I would describe it. But eventually made our way through Bedford, through Seymour, through Versailles and Versailles State Park. We made it all the way into Lawrenceburg, where all of a sudden the only way across was to take US 50, and it was busy, busy, busy traffic. There was no shoulder to speak of. We managed to find a good Samaritan who took us all the way into Newport, Kentucky, across the Ohio River from Cincinnati. So from Cincinnati, cut and dry. Basically, you're on Ohio Bicycle Route 1, and it is well signed all the way through the city, and then you're on the Little Miami Scenic Trail. And the Little Miami Scenic Trail takes you all the way into, I believe, Xenia. And at that point, you're probably on the Prairie Grass Trail. There's the Camp Chase Trail. There's the Roberts Pass Trail through there. A lot of different names of trails, but it's all part of the Ohio to Erie Rail Trail, and just as good of riding as you could possibly find. Just hats off, Ohio. What an excellent job you've done. Out of Cedarville, which is north of Xenia, it starts to get a little flat, a little bit unspectacular, but that doesn't last for very long. And then you suddenly find yourself in Columbus. And, the entrance into Columbus on the Ohio to Erie Trail is really gorgeous. You cross a couple of rivers, you go through a really cool scenic park, and then all of a sudden, boom, there's downtown. It's one of these classic kind of eastern downtowns with the more Art Deco style architecture. Leaving Columbus was kind of a bare urban trails along interstates, but then it suddenly dips into really deep forest and really pretty trails, and then suddenly it kind of spits you out into strip malls where there's no bike trail to speak of, and everything's very confused. And that's probably the only so-so part of the whole Ohio to Erie Trail was through that northern stretch of Columbus, especially through the suburbs. But once we got back on the trail, it was gorgeous riding again. I don't remember all the trail names. Kokosing River Trail goes through there, Berks County, I believe. But at any rate, you go through Mount Vernon, really cool little town called Kilbuck. And this is really the center of Amish country. Take that into Millersburg, take it into Massillon, Akron, and then you're following the Cuyahoga Valley National Historic Park. Just spectacular riding. You get these little boardwalks and you're just thinking, I'm crossing the country on these really awesome bike trails. How great is this? This is a particularly spectacular part of the trail. And that leads you into Cleveland. Now, we didn't follow the Ohio to Erie all the way into Cleveland. At some point, we broke off, and then we headed towards Lake Erie straight on up, and we just skirted downtown. And once we hit Lake Erie, we were pretty much following Lake Erie all the way until we got to Buffalo, New York. We absolutely loved this stretch of the road. We had Lake Erie to our left most of the time, vineyards all the way through, smelled just gorgeous, like you could just smell the grapes, the ripe grapes. Nice little towns, friendly people, and for the most part, really quiet. A couple of times the traffic got kind of crazy, but very little. That whole stretch, I think it's about 200 miles from Cleveland to Buffalo, and it was just awesome all the way through. You're pretty much following State Highway 5, whether you're in Ohio, I think it's State Highway 5, Pennsylvania, New York, you're also on Bicycle Route Z through there, and it's very well signed. They're used to cyclists, not a problem with traffic, really, really excellent riding. From Buffalo, we followed the Niagara River Trail north to the falls, and we spent a couple days in Niagara Falls. And from there, it was an easy little skip to the Erie Canal Trail. Once we hit the Erie Canal, it's smooth sailing. Erie Canal Trail, I don't know how many miles, 350, I'm not sure how many miles it is. Obviously very flat, follows the canal. Great history, especially in this part of the state. Following the Erie Canal Trail, there ain't much to it. You just follow it. There are stretches. There's a big stretch between Newark or Lyons and maybe Port Byron where you're on roads. But again, never a problem, always a shoulder, very well assigned, never was an issue. We followed the Erie Canal through Rochester, through Syracuse, through Rome, past Utica, along the Mohawk River, towns like Little Falls, Amsterdam, and it was at Amsterdam that we decided this was where we would start to cut up towards New England. So we didn't follow the Erie Canal all the way into Albany. We took New York 67 out of Amsterdam and followed that to New York 50, and then we followed New York 50 north into Saratoga Springs. And so from there we followed, it was kind of a series of bike paths. I don't remember their names, but we went through Glens Falls, and then I believe at Glens Falls, that's where we ran into a bike path that took us all the way down into Lake George. Really beautiful little lake, right there at the base of the Green Mountains of Vermont. We then had to do a little backtracking, climbed back out of Lake George and then across State Highway 149 into Fort Anne. It was too busy. That was kind of a busy stretch and it was a little bit nerve-wracking. And from Fort Anne, then it was just a quick little jaunt over to Granville, which is right on the Vermont-New York border. This is actually where Julianna, where we knew she had COVID. Mostly at that point we followed the Delaware and Hudson Rail Trail, which kind of skirts the line between New York and Vermont. Julianna was feeling like hell at the time, but it was a spectacular trail, just such beautiful colors. The surface was a little rough, but it was a great way to be welcomed into Vermont. So we took that into Castleton, and then we're basically following an alt US 4 route all the way into Rutland. US 4 is kind of a main way across Vermont. It's a very narrow state, as you probably already know. So it's a pretty busy road. Then in Rutland, we followed US 4 up into Killington, which is where we had to quarantine for a week or two. And then once we were feeling all better, we rode out of Killington. So we took US 4 from Killington all the way down into Woodstock, where Komoot had us take a little side road that went north of the Attaqua River. Just a gorgeous, gorgeous ride, mostly gravel, but covered bridges and beautiful farms, and it was just as good as it gets. And then you cross the Connecticut River and you're in New Hampshire, and you're in Lebanon. South Lebanon is where we ended up. We had to hang out there for a couple days waiting out another nor'easter. After a couple of days of rain in Lebanon, we kind of emerged, and we're still feeling really fatigued and kind of sick from the COVID. We thought, well, we'll just take highways. We were heading south towards Manchester, Concord and Manchester, so towards the southern part of the state, thinking that the Northern Rail Trail, which is what we really wanted to take, but thinking that was going to be a slog, probably a muddy slog after all that rain. But, we found the Northern Rail Trail, we took a look at it, and we decided, no, this looks very rideable. And we took that all the way down to Concord or so. It winds around, it adds a lot of miles, but it's so worth it. It goes through a lot of different terrain, some really excellent little towns. That was one of our longest rides. I think we hit maybe 60 miles that day. Again, fatigued with COVID and all gravel and, cold conditions, very damp. But it was one of the happiest, funnest days of my life. It was just magnificent, and I love that trail so much. Anyway, we got down into Concord, checked out the state capital of New Hampshire, and then we followed some roads down to Manchester. Logging Hill Road, Wood Hill Road, Twist Hill Road, they're all hills. I mean, it was a nice little steep climb coming out of Concord. I think there's probably an easier way through, but we made it down to Manchester. And in Manchester, we were able to catch the Rockingham Recreation Trail, which, didn't get a lot of really good reviews when I read about it on Trail Link. But despite the fact that we had some low bridges that we had to contend with, I thought it was a really great trail. Part of it was the time of the year. The colors were just amazing. It was just the peak of autumn. Beautiful, nice, smooth gravel with a lot of lakes in between. So yeah, I think we took that all the way to New Hampshire 108. That's where we kind of cut down and just followed Google Maps to get us into downtown Portsmouth. And then from downtown Portsmouth, we took the Memorial Bridge over into Kittery, Maine, where we spent the night, again waiting out another nor'easter until the next morning dawned bright and blue and beautiful, and we were able to dip our tires into the Atlantic.
All right, here we go to the Atlantic, ladies and gentlemen.
It was an incredible trip. The routing, God, the big wins. I mean, I'd say, let's start with the rail trails. The Olympic Discovery Trail, the Snoqualmie Valley Trail, or the Palouse to Cascades Trail going over the Cascades. Magnificent. A little trail that goes over Old Blewett Pass. It was actually an old highway, abandoned highway, but we didn't see one car the whole way. Loved taking US 2 across the desert. The Trail of the Coeur d'Alenes was exquisite and just such a gem. Get out there and check it out. Very, very nice. Montana had its moments, and it was definitely beautiful and it's very dramatic, but trail-wise, infrastructure-wise, not much to speak of. The Katy Trail, you know, who doesn't love riding along the Katy Trail? The farm roads of southern Illinois and southern Indiana. Southern Indiana, less farm roads, more like hill country. But, well, those were just a real surprise and were just fabulous, and we just loved that stretch so much. The Ohio to Erie Trail is just incredible. All the way through, every day seemed different than the last. The stretch along Lake Erie, we loved. Of course, the Erie Canal. Who doesn't love the Erie Canal? And then I would say, boy, riding across Vermont. The Delaware and Hudson is a great rail trail. The Northern Rail Trail is a great, amazing rail trail. And the route north of the Attaqua River, if you're crossing Vermont, that's definitely something you want to follow. And the Rockingham Rail Trail across southern New Hampshire was really, really great. Mistakes we made, you know, I don't know. Montana had its moments, but trail-wise, not much to speak of. It was really lacking sorely, and it was not, by far was the worst place for us to cycle for all kinds of reasons. You know, the Route of the Olympians was just a slog through loose stone. A lot of times we had to end up on Interstate 90 where we weren't, there was like no shoulders and really, really fast traffic. Yeah, not much I can say about riding through Montana. I wished we would have gone south out of Missoula and tried our luck going through that forest fire area, but again, you know, hindsight 2020, maybe there's no way we could have gotten through. I don't know. I second guess it. I think that would have been really an amazing part of the state. I think it would have been quiet. I think it would have been very cool. I wanted to do the Mickelson. I wanted to ride through the Black Hills. I wanted to do the Cowboy Trail across Nebraska. So those were all real misses, and something that I feel, you know, there's a little bit of a hole in my heart because of it. Every once in a while we ran into issues. Lawrenceburg in Indiana, trying to get into Cincinnati, that was just a miss. The Preston-Snoqualmie dead end in Washington, that was a real miss. But on the whole, it was an amazing trip. And I would hold up my route to anybody's in terms of crossing the country, especially if you want to spend time on rail trails, especially the original route. Like, I think that would have been really, really great. And hopefully we'll get a chance to ride that stretch again in the not too distant future. Maybe Julianna won't do it. Maybe it'll just be me. We'll see. But at any rate, I hope y'all start planning your trip. Crossing the country is such an epic experience. It's a life changer. Start making your plans soon. Until then, happy trails.
All right, 1 mile down, 3,999 to go.
Here we go.
Here we go. Woo!